The Arizona sun did not just shine, it bore down like a heavy hand, pressing the life out of the red earth until the ground cracked in surrender. It was the summer of 1886, and the heat in the territory was a physical thing, a shimmering curtain that distorted the horizon and made the distant mesas look like they were melting into the sky. Here, the distance between towns was not measured in miles, but in water canteens and prayers, and lately, the prayers were running as dry as the creek beds. Clara Whitmore wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand, leaving a streak of red dust across her pale skin. She stood in the shadow of her freight wagon, checking the cinch on the left trace horse. The animal blew out a breath, shifting its weight, and Clara murmured a soft sound, a low hum that vibrated in her chest. She was not a woman who spoke much to horses, or to people for that matter. Not anymore. Silence was safer. Silence did not make promises it could not keep. She gave the leather strap one final, hard tug. Her hands were not the soft, manicured hands of the women who sat on porches in the East, fanning themselves and drinking lemonade. Clara's hands were rough, the skin thickened by rope burns and the handle of a shovel. They were hands that knew how to deliver a calf, how to mend a fence, and, when the nights were dark and the memories too loud, how to hold a gun steady. At 27, she felt twice her age, her youth eroded by the wind and the relentless struggle to hold on to what little she had left. "Easy, boy," she whispered to the gelding, patting his damp neck. "We have a long way to go before the stars come out." The town of Bitter Creek was barely a town at all, just a collection of weathered timber buildings huddling together against the vast emptiness. The wind here carried whispers, and lately, those whispers were sharp with fear. Talk of Apache raiding parties moving north, of renegades who had refused the reservation, had everyone looking over their shoulders. But Clara knew there were worse things than Apaches out in the scrub. There were men who wore badges and smiled with their teeth while they stole the ground from under your feet. She walked to the back of the wagon, her boots crunching on the gravel. Under a heavy canvas tarp, hidden beneath sacks of grain and a crate of tinned peaches, lay a small, battered metal box. Inside that box was a ledger. It was a simple thing, bound in black leather that was peeling at the corners, filled with the cramped handwriting of her late husband, Samuel. But that book was heavier than the entire load of grain. It contained dates, names, and amounts proof of bribes paid by the copper mining company to Deputy Silas Crow. It was proof that the rebellion Samuel had supposedly been part of was nothing more than a convenient lie fabricated to clear the valley for the mine's expansion. Samuel had died for that book. He had been found 3 months ago, face down in a dry wash, a single bullet in his back. The official report said it was bandits. The town whispered it was bad luck. Clara knew it was murder. "Are you leaving out, Mrs. Whitmore?" The voice was smooth, like oil pouring over gravel. Clara stiffened, her hand instinctively brushing the skirt of her dress where her Colt Navy revolver was holstered underneath. She turned slowly, composing her face into a mask of weary indifference. Deputy Silas Crow stood on the boardwalk, leaning against a support post with a casual arrogance that made Clara's stomach churn. He was a handsome man in a sharp, predatory way, with a mustache that was waxed to perfection and eyes that were a shade too light, like shallow water over gray stones. His badge caught the harsh sunlight, gleaming with a mockery of justice. "Deputy," Clara acknowledged, her voice flat. "Got a delivery to make?" Crow stepped off the boardwalk, his spurs chiming softly in the quiet street. He walked around her wagon, running a hand along the wood as if he were inspecting it for defects. "Awful time to be on the road alone. Clara, you heard the talk. Geronimo's boys are restless. Some say there is a ghost dancing out there in the canyons." "I have heard the talk," Clara said, moving to block his path to the rear of the wagon. She did not step aside. "But bills do not wait for peace treaties, Deputy, and neither does the bank." Crow stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell the scent of bay rum and stale tobacco on him. He towered over her, a deliberate intimidation tactic she had seen him use on shopkeepers and drunks alike. "That is the truth," he drawled. "The bank is a harsh master. Shame about the land. Clara, I heard the foreclosure notice is set for next week. If you cannot pay the taxes—" He let the sentence hang, a threat wrapped in faux sympathy. "I will pay," Clara said, meeting his gaze. "I am heading to Prescott to settle the account." Crow's eyes narrowed just a fraction. Prescott. That is a 3-day ride for a heavy wagon. Maybe 4. A lot can happen in 4 days. "I know the road," she lied. She did not intend to take the main road. The main road was where Crow's men would be waiting, ready to stage another bandit attack. She intended to take the old trade route through the canyon, a path Samuel had shown her once, years ago. It was treacherous, steep, and cut through the heart of the territory. But it was the only way she could disappear. Crow smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. "You are a stubborn woman. Clara Whitmore. Samuel always said you had a spine of iron. Shame it did not save him." The mention of her husband sent a spike of hot rage through her chest, but Clara clamped down on it. Losing her temper now would cost her everything. "Samuel was a good man," she said quietly. "Better than most." "Sure he was," Crow agreed easily. "Just got mixed up in things he did not understand. Politics, land rights, messy business." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice. "You know, if you find yourself in over your head, Clara, you can always come to me. The mining company is looking to buy that plot of yours. They would pay a fair price, enough for you to go back east, find a nice husband, forget all this dust." "I am not selling," Clara said, each word hard and distinct. "And I'm not going east. This is my home." Crow stared at her for a long moment, his gaze dissecting her, searching for a crack in her armor. He was looking for fear, for hesitation. Clara gave him neither. She stood with her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, channeling every ounce of the discipline she had forged over 5 years of living on the frontier. Finally. Crow laughed, a short, barking sound. He stepped back, tipping the brim of his hat. "Well, safe travels then, darling. Do not let the heat get to you." He turned and walked away, his stride loose and confident. Clara watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew he had not believed her. He knew she was up to something. He was letting her leave town because it was easier to dispose of a woman in the wilderness than in the middle of the street where witnesses might talk. He was letting the cat run so the hounds would have something to chase. Clara turned back to the wagon and climbed up onto the seat. The leather was burning hot against her dress. She gathered the reins, her fingers trembling slightly now that his eyes were off her. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of sagebrush and dry pine, and let it out slowly. "Get up," she called to the team. Slapping the reins, the wagon lurched forward, the wheels grinding against the dirt. Clara did not look back at Bitter Creek. There was nothing there for her anymore but ghosts and lies. As the town faded into the shimmering heat haze behind her, Clara reached into her pocket and closed her hand around a small, cold object. It was an iron key, rusted and heavy. It belonged to an old trapper's cabin halfway through the canyon route, a place Samuel had bought years ago and never used. It was the only shelter on the shortcut, a tiny dot of safety in a landscape that wanted to kill her. "Do not let them take anything else," she told herself. The thought was a rhythm that matched the creaking of the wagon wheels. They had taken her husband. They had taken her peace. They were trying to take her land, but they would not take this book. Not while she had breath in her lungs and a bullet in the chamber. The road out of town wound through a landscape that was as beautiful as it was unforgiving. Giant saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels on the hillsides, their arms raised in eternal surrender to the sun. The earth was a tapestry of burnt ochre and dusty sage, broken only by the occasional jagged scar of an arroyo. It was a land that demanded respect, and Clara gave it freely. She kept her eyes on the horizon, scanning for the telltale dust cloud of riders, her ears straining for the sound of hooves. By late afternoon, the heat had settled into a dull, throbbing ache behind her eyes. The water in her canteen was warm and tasted of tin, but she drank it sparingly. She pushed the horses harder than she usually would, needing to put distance between herself and Crow's smile. She thought of the ledger hidden beneath the grain. It was not just paper and ink. It was the livelihood of the Miller family down in the valley, who had been evicted last week. It was the reputation of Dr. Harrow, who had been threatened into silence when he tried to report the strange bruising on Samuel's body. It was the truth, and in a place where the law was written by the man with the biggest gun. The truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. Clara remembered the night Samuel had shown her the book. It had been raining, a rare, torrential downpour that hammered against the roof of their small cabin. Samuel had looked old that night, the lines around his eyes deep with worry. "If anything happens to me, Clara," he had said, pressing the book into her hands, "you take this to Judge Henry and Prescott. Do not trust anyone locally, not the sheriff, and definitely not Crow. You promised me." She had promised, thinking he was just being paranoid. She had been wrong. The sun began to dip toward the western horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange. The shadows of the cacti stretched out long and thin, like grasping fingers reaching for the wagon. Clara turned the team off the main road, guiding them toward a narrow, rocky trail that disappeared into the mouth of a box canyon. This was the point of no return. The main road was wide and well-traveled, patrolled by the stagecoach lines. This trail was a scar on the land, barely wide enough for the wagon wheels, winding through the country that even the coyotes avoided. It was the path of smugglers and outcasts. As the wagon rumbled over the uneven ground, Clara felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. It was a physical sensation, an ache in the center of her chest. She had always prided herself on her independence. She had come west with her father when she was 18, buried him 2 years later, and married Samuel not out of desperation, but out of a mutual respect that had grown into a deep, quiet love. She did not need a man to tell her how to live. She could shoot a rattlesnake at 20 paces and dress a deer before breakfast. But God, she missed him. She missed the sound of his boots on the floorboards. She missed the way he smelled of sawdust and tobacco. She hated this needing someone, hating the void their absence left behind. It made her feel weak, and Clara Whitmore could not afford to be weak. "Pull it together. Clara," she muttered to the empty air. The canyon walls rose up around her, sheer cliffs of red rock that blocked out the dying sun. The temperature dropped, the air growing still and heavy. The silence here was different. It was not the peaceful silence of the open desert. It was a watching silence. It felt as though the rocks themselves were holding their breath. She checked the Winchester rifle resting at her feet, making sure it was within easy reach. The stories of the Apache were not just stories. She knew that. The government had declared the wars over. But out here, treaties were just paper. There were bands of men who had lost everything: their land, their families, their way of life, and they fought with the ferocity of the cornered. Clara did not blame them. In a way, she felt a strange kinship with them. She was being hunted too. She was being pushed off her land by men who saw the world only in terms of profit and loss. But fear was a cold companion. Every shadow that shifted looked like a crouching warrior. Every snap of a twig sounded like an ambush. Clara kept her eyes moving, her body tense. She was not a soldier, but she was a survivor. She had survived the cholera outbreak of '82. She had survived the drought of '84. She would survive this. Night fell completely, wrapping the canyon in a cloak of velvet darkness. Clara lit a lantern and hung it from the side of the wagon, the pool of yellow light illuminating the rumps of the horses and a few feet of the rocky trail ahead. It was dangerous to show a light, but it was more dangerous to drive a wagon blind on this terrain. One wrong step and a wheel could shatter, leaving her stranded miles from water. She drove for another 3 hours, until the horses were stumbling with fatigue. She found a small alcove in the canyon wall, a natural refuge protected from the wind, and pulled the wagon in. Her movements were automatic as she unhitched the team, rubbed them down, and gave them a measure of grain and water. Only when the animals were settled did she tend to herself. She built a small fire, keeping the flames low and protected by rocks to hide the glow. She heated a tin of beans and ate them mechanically, barely tasting the food, sitting by the dying embers. Clara pulled the key from her pocket again. In the firelight, the rust looked like dried blood. The old cabin was still a day's ride away. If she could make it there, she could rest. There was a spring nearby, and the cabin had thick walls. She could fortify it, sleep for a few hours without one eye open. She wrapped herself in her bedroll, lying underneath the wagon with her hand on the revolver. The ground was hard, but she was used to it. Above her, through the gap in the canyon walls, she could see a slice of the heavens. The stars were brilliant, cold and in different diamonds scattered on black velvet. Right place, she whispered to herself, a bitter irony coloring the words. She was in the middle of nowhere, hunted by a corrupt lawman, carrying a death warrant in a metal box. It was exactly the wrong place to be. But as sleep finally began to pull at her, a different thought surfaced. It was the memory of Crow's smirk, the way he had looked at her land as if he already owned it. Let him come, she thought, her grip tightening on the gun. Let him try. She did not know that 20 miles behind her, 2 riders were picking their way through the darkness, following the deep tracks of her wagon wheels. She did not know that 20 miles ahead of her, a man was bleeding onto the floor of the very cabin she sought, a man who had been hunted longer and harder than she could imagine. Clara slept, but it was a light, restless sleep, filled with dreams of fire and the sound of breaking glass. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive. The sky was heavy with unreleased rain, trapping the heat in the canyon like an oven. Clara woke before sunrise, her body stiff, her mouth dry. She wasted no time. Cold coffee and a piece of hardtack served as breakfast. By the time the first rays of the sun hit the top of the cliffs, she was moving again. The trail grew rougher. The wagon groaned and creaked, protesting every rock and rut. Clara had to walk alongside the team for long stretches to lighten the load, guiding the horses by hand. The dust coated her throat, making it hard to swallow. Around noon, she found the first sign that she was not alone. She had stopped to check a hoof on the right horse when she saw it. On the ground, near a cluster of prickly pear cactus, was a set of tracks. They were not boot prints, they were moccasin prints, faint but distinct, crossing the trail from east to west. Clara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She knelt, touching the edge of the print. The sand was still crumbling into the depression. They were fresh, less than an hour old. She stood up slowly, scanning the ridges above her. The canyon was silent, too silent. Even the cicadas had stopped their buzzing. Apache, she breathed. Panic flared, bright and hot. But she forced it down. If they were watching her, she was already dead. If they had not attacked yet, maybe they were just passing through, or maybe they were waiting for better ground. She climbed back onto the wagon, reaching for the rifle. She laid it across her lap this time. Safety off. "Hey-ya!" she shouted, snapping the reins. The horses sensed her tension and surged forward. The wagon bounced violently, but Clara did not slow down. She had to get to the cabin. It was defensible. It was a shelter. The hours dragged on, a torture of suspense. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Clara's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. She found herself talking to Samuel in her head, asking him for guidance, for strength, just a little further. "Sam, just take me to the door." Finally, as the afternoon sun began to lengthen the shadows once more, the canyon opened up into a small, secluded box valley. There, nestled against a backdrop of towering pines and red boulders, stood the cabin. It was rough-hewn timber, gray with age, with a sagging porch and a stone chimney that leaned slightly to the left. But to Clara, it looked like a palace. It stood on a slight rise, commanding a view of the approach. She pulled the wagon around the back, hiding it as best she could in a thicket of scrub oak. She unhitched the horses quickly, tethering them on long lines so they could graze on the sparse grass near the creek. Then, grabbing her rifle and the heavy metal box, she walked up the slope to the cabin. The place looked abandoned. Weeds grew tall around the steps. The windows were dark, staring out like hollow eyes. There was no sign of life. No smoke from the chimney, no movement. Clara reached the porch, the wood groaning under her boots. She set the box down and fished the rusty key from her pocket. Her hand shook slightly as she fitted it into the lock. The mechanism was stiff, resisting her. She gritted her teeth and twisted hard. With a sharp click, the bolt slid back. She pushed the door open. The interior was dim, smelling of dust and pine pitch and old wood smoke. Shafts of light cut through the gloom from the cracks in the shutters. Clara stepped inside, the rifle butt pressed against her shoulder, her finger on the trigger. She swept the room, a rough table, 2 broken chairs, a stone fireplace cold with ash. It was empty. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 2 days. She was safe. For now. She lowered the rifle and walked to the table, setting the metal box down. She ran her hand over the rough wood of the table. Then she stopped. Her fingers had brushed against something on the table surface. She looked down. In the center of the dusty table, there was a small, clean circle. And in the center of that circle was a smear of something dark and wet. Clara touched it. It was sticky, red, fresh blood. And near the fireplace, on the hearth, the ashes were not cold. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curled up from a log that was still smoldering gray at its core. The silence of the cabin suddenly felt very loud. Someone had been here. Someone was still here. Clara spun around, raising the rifle again, her heart slamming against her ribs. She looked toward the back of the cabin, where a heavy curtain made of an old blanket hung across the doorway to the single bedroom. The curtain moved, just a fraction, as if caught by a draft, but the windows were closed. Clara swallowed hard. She stepped toward the curtain, the floorboards creaking under her weight. "Come out," she ordered, her voice shaking but loud. "I have a gun, and I will use it." Silence. She took another step. "I said, come out." She reached out with the barrel of the rifle and shoved the curtain aside. The room beyond was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun streaming through a gap in the back shutters. And there, standing by the small wash basin, was a man. He was not a white man. His skin was the color of bronze, slick with water and sweat. His hair was long and black, hanging wet around his shoulders. He was stark naked, having clearly just finished washing. He was lean and muscular, his body a map of scars. But what caught Clara's eye was the fresh, angry wound on his shoulder that was oozing blood, and the long hunting knife resting on the washstand, inches from his hand. He did not flinch when the curtain flew back. He did not reach for the knife. He did not cover himself. He simply turned his head slowly and looked at her. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and utterly calm. There was no fear in them, only a weary sort of amusement. Clara stood frozen, the rifle pointed at his chest. Her breath caught in her throat, the shock of finding him, the shock of his nudity, and the realization of what he was, robbed her of speech. The Apache warrior looked her up and down, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin prickle. Then, a corner of his mouth quivered. "Right place, darling," he drawled, his English accented but clear, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small room. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. The safety was off. 1 pound of pressure and he was dead. But she did not fire, because in that split second, she saw something else. She saw the way he was leaning slightly against the wall for support. She saw the tremor in his legs. She saw the haunted look behind the amusement in his eyes. He was not attacking. He was waiting. And outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the cabin, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of a long, dark night. The silence that followed his words was heavier than the iron of the Winchester rifle in Clara's hands. "Right place, darling." The drawl hung in the stagnant air of the cabin. low and laced with a grit that sounded like boots dragging over gravel. The man stood there, framed by the dying light, unashamed of his nakedness, his bronze skin slick with river water and the darker, viscous sheen of fresh blood on his shoulder. He did not move to cover himself. He did not reach for the knife that lay on the washstand, though his fingers were mere inches from the handle. He simply leaned his hip against the rough-hewn wall, taking some of the weight off his left leg, and watched her over the barrel of her gun. Clara felt the trigger bite into the pad of her index finger. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a stark contrast to the icy calculation flooding her mind. She was a woman alone, miles from civilization, facing an Apache warrior in a room the size of a prison cell. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to fire, to put a bullet in his chest before he could lunge, but she did not. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was still standing. She had made enough noise approaching the cabin to wake the dead. She had struggled with the lock. She had walked across the creaky floorboards. If this man had wanted to kill her, she would have been dead before she ever touched the curtain. He had listened to her come. He had waited. "Cover yourself," Clara commanded. Her voice was steady, stripped of fear, though her insides were twisting like a knot of vipers. She did not lower the rifle. The man's dark eyes flickered with something that might have been amusement, or perhaps pain. He moved slowly, telegraphing his actions, and reached for a pair of rough canvas trousers draped over the back of a broken chair. He pulled them on with a wince, his breath hitching as the movement pulled at the wound on his shoulder. It was a nasty gash, deep and ragged, the kind made by a bullet that had grazed the bone but failed to stick. "You have a steady hand for a freight driver," he said. He sat heavily on the edge of the low cot, the mattress groaning under his weight. He picked up a rag and pressed it against his bleeding shoulder, his eyes never leaving hers. "Most people shake when they point a gun at me." "I am not most people," Clara said. "And you are bleeding on my floor." "It is a borrowed floor," he corrected. "I do not think the owner holds the deed anymore." "The owner is dead," Clara said. "Or missing, which likely means dead." "Then he does not mind." Clara took a step back, widening the distance between them but keeping him in her sights. The tension in the room was a living thing, prowling between them. This was a dance, a dangerous negotiation where one wrong word could turn the floorboards red. "Who are you?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. The descriptions given by the bounty hunters in town had been vague, a savage, a ghost, a monster, but the man sitting before her was flesh and bone. "Names are heavy things to carry," he murmured. He gestured with his chin toward the door. "You barred the door when you came in. That was wise. But if you plan to shoot me, you should unbar it first. The noise will bring others. You will want a running start." Clara narrowed her eyes. "Others, men with badges that shine too bright," he said. "And men who hunt for gold. They are tracking the blood. My blood." "Deputy Crow," Clara said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. The warrior's expression hardened. The amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. "Crow is a dog who barks where his master points. But yes, Crow is behind me. And if you are here, driving a wagon on a road that leads to nowhere, then perhaps Crow is behind you too." It was not a question. It was an assessment. "I am just a traveler," Clara lied. "Travelers take the main road," he countered. "Fugitives take the canyon." He shifted on the cot, and a fresh line of blood escaped the rag. Running down his bicep, "I need 1 hour. 1 hour to bind this and let the fire in my blood cool. Then I will be gone." "And why should I give you a minute, let alone an hour?" Clara asked. "There is a price on your head. I could drag you back to Bitter Creek and pay off my land." He looked at her then, really looked at her, with eyes that seemed to see through the dust on her dress to the desperation hidden in her bones. "You could," he agreed softly, "but you will not, because you hold that rifle like you hate it, and because you know that if you drag me back to Crow, you are not handing him a criminal. You are handing him a silence." Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine. He knew, somehow, in the way she stood, or perhaps simply because he knew the nature of the man hunting them both. He understood that she was running from the law just as much as he was. 1 hour, he repeated. You give me shelter for 1 hour. You let me rest. In exchange, I will tell you where the wire is strung. Clara frowned. Wire? Crow has rigged the pass, he said. 3 miles north, a rock slide waiting for a vibration. You take your wagon through there. You will be buried before you hear the rumble. I can show you the goat track. The way around. It was a transaction. Cold, hard, and practical. Clara lowered the rifle an inch. She needed to get to Prescott. If the pass was trapped, she was dead anyway. Stay where you are, she ordered. Do not move! She backed out of the room, keeping her eyes on him until the curtain fell back into place. She hurried to the front door, unbolted it, and slipped out onto the porch. The evening air was cooling rapidly, but Clara felt feverish. She needed to check the horses. She needed to make sure she could flee if this truce broke. She walked quickly to the scrub oak where she had hidden the wagon. The horses were standing with their heads low, tired but calm. Clara ran her hands over the harness of the lead mare. She checked the cinch, the bit, the long leather reins. Her hand stopped. Her stomach dropped to her boots. The left rein of the trace horse was severed. She lifted the leather strap. It was not a tear from wear and age. It was a clean, diagonal slice, cut halfway through, leaving just enough leather to hold for a few miles of walking. But at a gallop, or under the strain of a steep climb, it would have snapped. The wagon would have careened off the trail, tumbling into the canyon below. Clara stared at the cut, her mind racing. Taza, the Apache inside, could not have done this. He had been in the cabin, bleeding, washing, and the cut was not fresh. The edges of the leather were already dry. This had been done in Bitter Creek. Crow. It was a delayed death sentence. Crow had smiled at her, tipped his hat, and sent her off to die in an accident on the canyon road. He had not needed to kill her in town. He had simply sabotaged her wagon and let the terrain do the work. He had sent a man to follow her, to watch the inevitable happen. That son of a bitch, Clara whispered, the profanity slipping out before she could catch it. She looked out into the gathering dark. Somewhere out there, among the rocks and the shadows, someone was watching, waiting for her to crash, waiting for the end. She could not leave. Not now, not with the harness compromised. She needed to repair it, and she could not do that in the dark without a fire, and a fire outside would be a beacon to whoever was tracking her. She was trapped. She turned back to the cabin. The man inside Taza was her only leverage. He knew the land. He knew the traps. And right now, he was the only other person in this godforsaken territory who wanted Silas Crow dead as much as she did. Clara walked back inside, barring the door behind her with a definitive thud. She marched through the main room. Grabbing a roll of clean linen from her supplies and a small jar of salve she kept for the horses, she pushed through the curtain. Taza had not moved. He was watching the entrance, his face a mask of stoic endurance, but the sweat beading on his upper lip betrayed the pain he was in. You did not run, he said. My rein is cut, Clara said sharply, tossing the linen onto the cot beside him. Sabotaged. If I had pushed the team on the incline, I would be dead. Taza's eyes narrowed. Crow likes his accidents. He does, Clara said. She leaned the rifle against the wall, within reach, and pulled a chair closer to the cot. She was committed now. I can fix the leather, but it will take time. I have to sew it, which means we are both stuck here until moonset at least. She gestured to his shoulder. Let me see it. Taza hesitated. For a second, the warrior instinct flared in his eyes, the refusal to be touched, to be vulnerable. But then he nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. He lowered the bloody rag. The wound was ugly. The bullet had furrowed through the muscle of the deltoid. It needed cleaning, and it needed stitching. This is going to hurt, Clara said, opening the jar of salve. It smelled of sulfur and arnica. Pain is just information, Taza grunted. Then prepare to be very well informed, she retorted. She set to work, She poured water from the pitcher onto a clean cloth and began to scrub the dried blood from his skin. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as they touched him. His skin was fever hot, the muscle beneath it hard as iron. He was a landscape of violence. She saw other scars, white lines from knives, round puckers from old bullets. As she worked, cleaning the wound with a detached efficiency, Taza did not make a sound. He stared at the wall, his jaw locked so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. Clara reached for his arm to steady him as she applied the salve. Her fingers circled his wrist. She froze. Around both of his wrists, there were bands of scar tissue. They were thick, white, and raised, ringing the bone completely. They were not the scars of battle. They were the scars of chafing, of metal biting into flesh over weeks, maybe months. Shackles. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting him. Taza pulled his arm back sharply, breaking her grip. A flash of shame, raw and intense, cut through his stoic mask before he walled it off again. "You were a prisoner," Clara said softly. It was not an accusation. "I was a scout," Taza said, his voice bitter. "For the army. At Fort Apache. I tracked them. I found water for them. I negotiated for them. And this is how they paid you." Clara gestured to his wrists. "They paid me in safety," Taza said. "For my mother. For my sisters." But when the wind changed, and the politicians in Washington decided all Apaches were the same, the scouts were the first to be chained. They said it was for our protection. He let out a harsh, dry laugh. "I did not wait for them to protect me to death." Clara looked at the scars again. She saw the desperation there. This was not a man who killed for sport. This was a man who had been used, betrayed, and caged. He was a wolf that had chewed its own leg off to get out of the trap. And now, here he was, bleeding in her cabin, while the same law that had chained him was coming to kill her for a book of numbers. The fear in Clara's chest began to recede, replaced by a strange, cold resolve. She understood desperation. She understood what it was like to be looked at and seen as nothing more than a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. "Hold still," Clara said, her voice softer now. "I am going to wrap this tight." She leaned in, winding the linen around his shoulder. She was close enough to smell him river water, blood, and the deep, dusty scent of the desert. For a moment, the world shrank down to the circle of lamplight in the small room. The boundary between them white woman and Apache warrior blurred under the necessity of survival. "You said you know the way around the rock slide," Clara said, tying off the bandage. "I do," Taza said. He tested the movement of his arm, grimacing but nodding in approval. "It is a goat path, narrow. Your wagon will struggle, but it will pass." "Good," Clara said. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Because we leave at first light. You are going to guide me." Taza looked up at her. "We. You need a ride out of this canyon before your blood leaves a trail a blind man could follow," Clara said practically. "And I need someone who can see a trap before I drive into it. We are stuck with each other." Taza. It was the first time she had used his name. The sound of it seemed to change the air in the room. Taza studied her face, searching for deception. He saw only the hard set of her jaw and the tired determination in her gray eyes. "Crow will not stop," Taza warned. "If he is hunting you, he will hunt you until the ocean. Then he has a long ride ahead of him," Clara said. She picked up the rifle. "Get some sleep. I will take the first watch." She turned to leave the room, but his voice stopped her. "Clara," she paused, her hand on the curtain. It was strange to hear her name on his tongue. "The man who cut your rein," Taza said quietly. "He is likely waiting on the ridge, watching the cabin. When the sun comes up, he will expect to see wreckage. If he sees a wagon moving, he will signal Crow." Clara gripped the rifle tighter. "Then we had better make sure he does not see anything?" "No," Taza said. He reached for his knife, his fingers closing around the handle with a familiar grace. "I will make sure he does not see anything." Clara looked at the knife, then at the man. She saw the lethal capability returning to him as the pain receded. She realized then that she had not just found a guide, she had found a weapon. And God help her, She was going to use it. "Just sleep," she said. "We can deal with the devil in the morning." She stepped out into the main room and sat in the chair by the door, the rifle across her lap. She listened to the wind howling outside, sounding like the voices of lost souls. She touched the pocket of her dress, where the key to the cabin lay cold against her hip. She had thought this cabin was a sanctuary. She was wrong. It was a foxhole, and the war had just begun. The morning sun bled over the rim of the canyon, painting the rocks in violent shades of crimson and bruised purple. It was a deceptive beauty, masking the brutal heat that would follow within the hour. Clara Whitmore stood by the front wheel of her wagon, testing the leather rein she had spent half the night stitching. The thread was thick, the needlework ugly but functional. It would hold. It had to hold. Taza stood a few feet away, leaning against the porch post of the cabin. He had found a rough cotton shirt in the trunk at the foot of the bed. Samuel's old work shirt. It was tight across his broad shoulders, the fabric straining against the bandages beneath, but it covered the copper skin that had been so distracting the night before. He looked less like a wild spirit of the canyon now, and more like a man trying to fit into a world that had no shape for him. "The deal is simple," Clara said, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. She wiped her hands on her skirt. "You get me past the rock slide and through the Chola Flats. Once we hit the ridge that overlooks the Verde Valley, we go our separate ways. You take the high trails where the horses cannot go, and I take the wagon down to Prescott." Taza studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. "And if Crow is waiting at the ridge?" "Then that is my problem," Clara replied, though the thought made her stomach tighten. "I keep the ledger. You keep your freedom. Do we have an accord?" Taza pushed himself off the post. He moved with a predator's grace, despite the limp that favored his left leg. "We have an accord, Clara Whitmore, but do not think the desert cares about your deals. Out here, the only law is survival." They moved out 10 minutes later. Clara drove the team, her hands white-knuckled on the reins. Taza sat beside her on the bench seat. His presence was a heavy weight, a heat source that radiated against her side. Every time the wagon lurched over a stone, their shoulders brushed, a brief, electric contact that Clara tried desperately to ignore. He did not speak much. He simply pointed, a gesture to the left to avoid a patch of soft sand that would mire the wheels, a sharp motion to the right to skirt a nest of rattlesnakes sunning themselves on the flat rocks. He read the land as if it were a map drawn in ink, seeing paths where Clara saw only formidable wilderness. By midday, the heat was a physical hammer. The air shimmered, turning the horizon into a watery mirage. They had bypassed the trapped main road, taking a goat track that clung to the side of the mesa. It was terrifyingly narrow. On one side, the red rock wall rose straight up to the sky. On the other, a sheer drop plunged 500 feet into the dry wash below. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the ears of the lead horse, refusing to look down. She could feel Taza watching her. "You drive well," he said suddenly. The compliment was grudging, stripped of any flattery. "I had to learn," Clara said through gritted teeth. "Samuel, my husband, he taught me," said a woman on the frontier who cannot handle a team is just a passenger in her own life. "He was a wise man," Taza murmured, rare for a white eyes. They rounded a sharp bend, and the trail widened slightly, merging briefly with an old cattle drover's path before cutting back into the wilderness. Down below, on a stretch of the main road visible through a gap in the rocks, Clara saw movement. She pulled back on the reins. Whoa! Below them, a small covered wagon had thrown a wheel. A family, a man, a woman, and 2 small children stood in the dust. They looked defeated. Their belongings were scattered in the dirt, a rocking chair, a trunk, a sack of flour that had burst, dusting the red earth with white. They were staring hopelessly at the broken axle. Clara's heart gave a painful lurch. She recognized the look on the woman's face. It was the look of someone who had just realized the world was ending. "They are stuck," Clara said, reaching for the brake. "They have no water. We have to go down. We have to help them." Taza's hand shot out, clamping over her wrist. His grip was iron hard. "No!" Clara turned on him, fury flaring. "Let go of me. There are children down there. They will die in this heat." "If you go down there," Taza said, his voice low and urgent, "you leave the high ground. You go back to the road Crow is watching, and you die, and that book dies with you. I cannot just leave them." "Look at them," Taza commanded, pointing with his free hand. "Look at the cart. They are not travelers. They are evictees. They are running because men with badges told them their land belongs to the copper company now." Clara looked closer. He was right. The wagon was overloaded. A desperate flight rather than a planned journey. "They are victims of the same man you fight," Taza continued. "You want to save them. You want to save the 100 families who will come after them. Then you deliver the book. You give them water now. They live another day to starve. You bring justice to Prescott. You give them their lives back." Clara stared at the family, tears pricking her eyes. The mother was holding a bonnet over the baby's head, shielding it from the sun. The father was kicking the broken wheel in futile rage. "It is cruel," Clara whispered. "It is war," Taza corrected. He released her wrist. The red marks of his fingers faded slowly from her skin. "Do not mistake kindness for weakness, Clara, but do not mistake stupidity for mercy either. Drive." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. She looked at the family one last time, whispering a silent apology, and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, climbing higher into the rocks, leaving the tragedy below to play out in the silence of the desert. Miles away, in the dusty thoroughfare of Bitter Creek, Mason Rudd struck a match on the sole of his boot. The flame flared, illuminating the weathered face of a man who looked like he had been carved from oak and left out in the rain. Rudd was a bounty hunter, but he did not dress like the peacocks who usually plied the trade. No silver conchos, no embroidered vest. He wore dust-colored canvas and a hat that had seen better decades. He stood before the sheriff's notice board, staring at a fresh poster that Deputy Crow had just tacked up. It was not a picture of Taza. It was a sketch of a woman. Wanted Clara Whitmore, for theft of mining company payroll and aiding a fugitive. Reward $1,000. $1,000, Rudd muttered. "That is a lot of coin for a freight hauler." Crow stepped out of the office, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw Rudd and smiled, a shark showing its teeth. "Interested. Mason, I am interested in why a widow who hauls grain is suddenly carrying a payroll," Rudd said, his voice a slow rumble. "And why is the reward higher than the one for the Apache?" "She is smart," Crow said, his eyes cold. "And she has been hiding that savage. They are working together. She used her wagon to smuggle him out past my checkpoints. She is dangerous. Mason, do not let the pretty face fool you." Rudd pulled a cigar from his pocket and lit it. He puffed smoke into the hot air. "I do not care about pretty, Deputy. I care about the contract. Is she alive or dead?" "Preferably alive," Crow said. "She has property that belongs to the county. But if she resists, well, the territory is a dangerous place." Rudd nodded slowly. He did not like Silas Crow. He smelled a rat in the woodpile. But gold was gold, and Mason Rudd had debts to pay. "I found tracks at the canyon mouth," Rudd said. "Wagon wheels, heavy load, and footprints that walked too soft for boots. They went up the goat track." Crow's expression tightened. "Go get them. Mason, bring me the woman and the box she carries." "You can skin the Apache for all I care." Rudd tipped his hat and walked toward his horse. He would find them. He always found them. But as he mounted up, he wondered what kind of woman would run with a wolf like Taza. It was an interesting puzzle, and Mason Rudd hated unsolved puzzles. Night fell with the sudden violence of a door slamming shut. The heat of the day evaporated, replaced by a bone-chilling cold as a storm front rolled in over the Mogollon Rim. Clara and Taza made camp in a shallow overhang beneath a limestone cliff. It was not a cave, just a depression in the rock that offered shelter from the wind. The rain began as a whisper and quickly grew into a roar, a deluge that turned the dry washes into churning rivers of mud. They built a small fire near the mouth of the overhang, feeding it with dried mesquite roots Taza had gathered. The wagon was parked tight against the cliff wall. The horses hobbled and miserable in the downpour. Clara sat close to the fire, shivering. Her dress was damp from the last hour of the drive. Taza sat opposite her, cross-legged, cleaning his knife with a piece of oilcloth. The firelight danced over his face, sharpening the angles of his cheekbones and nose. The space was small, intimate. The storm outside created a wall of noise that isolated them from the rest of the world. Here, in this circle of flickering light, the lines between settler and native, widow and warrior, began to blur. Clara reached for the coffee pot resting on the stones near the fire. At the same time, Taza reached for it. Their hands brushed. Clara pulled back as if she had been burned. Taza did not flinch. He picked up the pot and poured the dark liquid into her tin cup, then into his own. "Thank you," she whispered. He handed her the cup. His fingers were long and calloused, strong hands that could kill or guide. As she took the cup, her fingers grazed his palm. The contact lingered for a second longer than necessary. She looked up at him. Taza was watching her, not with the predatory gaze of a man looking at a woman, but with a profound curiosity. "You do not look at me like the others," he said quietly. "The others? The white women in the towns." Taza said, "When they see me, they see a monster from their bedtime stories, or they see a curiosity, an animal in a zoo. You look at me like I'm just a man who is bleeding on your floor." Clara wrapped her hands around the warm metal of the cup. "I have seen monsters, Taza. They usually wear suits and smile while they sign papers. You are just trying to survive. Like me." Taza took a sip of the bitter coffee. "Survival is a lonely trade." "It does not have to be," Clara said, the words slipping out before she could check them. The air between them grew thick, charged with an unspoken tension. It was not the romance of storybooks. It was the raw, magnetic pull of two people who had seen the bottom of the well and recognized the darkness in each other's eyes. Taza shifted, the firelight catching the damp sheen of his skin where the shirt fell open at the neck. Clara felt a flush rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. She looked away, needing to break the moment. She reached for the metal box she always kept by her side. She opened it and pulled out the ledger. "I need to check the dates again," she said, her voice sounding too loud in the small space. "Make sure I have the sequence right for the judge." She opened the book, running her finger down the column of figures. Taza watched her, then leaned forward. "Page 42, he said. Clara looked up, startled. "What?" "The page you are looking for," Taza said. "It is page 42, September the 12th, 1885. Clara stared at him. "You can read?" "The army thought it would be useful," Taza said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "Teach the scout to read English so he can read the maps, so he can read the orders. They did not think I would read the reports they left on the commander's desk." He moved around the fire, coming to sit beside her. He was close, his shoulder brushing hers. He smelled of rain and wood smoke and sage. He pointed a finger at the ledger, tracing a line of ink. "Here," he said. "You see this payment for services rendered? $500 to S. Crow." "I know," Clara said. "That is the bribe for the water rights." "No," Taza said softly. "Look at the date. Clara, September 12th. Clara froze. September 12th, the day Samuel had died. "And look here," Taza said, moving his finger to the margin. There was a small note, scrawled in a different hand, likely the mine owner's. "It says obstacle removed, route clear." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The world tilted on its axis. "Samuel," she breathed. "It was not just a robbery. It was not just bad luck." "He was the obstacle," Taza said, his voice gentle but unyielding. "They paid Crow $500 to kill him. It is right here, in ink." A sob tore itself from Clara's throat, a harsh, jagged sound. She slammed the book shut, her hands trembling violently. The grief she had pushed down, the anger she had bottled up to survive, threatened to explode. "They bought him," she whispered. Like a sack of grain. $500. She buried her face in her hands. She felt Taza's presence beside her. a solid, warm anchor in the storm. He did not hug her, that would have been too much, too soon, but he placed his hand on her back, between her shoulder blades. The heat of his palm seeped through her dress, grounding her. "Breathe," he said. "Do not let the grief take you. Turn it into iron. You need to be iron to face Crow." Clara inhaled sharply, the smell of the rain mixing with the scent of him. She nodded, wiping her eyes. She turned to look at him. His face was inches from hers. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain drummed against the rock. The fire crackled. The distance between them was nothing. If she leaned forward, if he leaned in. Taza pulled back slowly, removing his hand. The loss of contact was a physical chill. "Sleep," he said, his voice rough. "Tomorrow we hit the Chola Flats. The land there is tricky. You will need your eyes." He moved back to his side of the fire, lying down with his back to her. But Clara knew he was not sleeping. She could see the tension in his shoulders. She lay down on her bedroll, clutching the ledger to her chest. The anger was there, cold and hard as a diamond. But beneath it was something else, a new feeling. She was not alone in the dark anymore. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the desert washed clean and smelling of creosote. The air was cool, the sky a piercing, impossible blue. They packed up in silence, the memory of the night hanging between them. As they guided the wagon down from the rocks onto the flatlands, the landscape changed. They entered the Chola forest. Thousands of jumping cacti stretched out before them, their skeletal arms glowing silver in the sunlight. It was a beautiful, deadly garden. One brush against the spines and they would embed themselves in flesh, almost impossible to remove. "Watch the birds," Taza said, breaking the silence. He pointed to a hawk circling high above. "It is hunting," Clara said. "No," Taza corrected. "It is watching. See how it dips its wing. It is riding a thermal. That means the air is rising there. That means heat, rock." He pointed to the ground. "And look at the sand. See the ripples. Wind," Clara said. "Wind tells you where the water went," Taza said. "It tells you where the ground is hard enough for the wheels. You fight the land, Clara, and you die. The land is bigger than you. It is older, but if you listen to it, if you let it speak to you, it will let you pass." Clara looked at the desert with new eyes. She saw not just emptiness, but a system, a language. "You speak it well," she said. "It is my mother," Taza said simply. "And my father." They drove on, the wagon navigating the maze of thorns. Clara felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. She realized then that Taza was giving her something more valuable than guidance. He was giving her the tools to survive without him. "We are close to the ridge," Taza said around noon. "Once we cross the dry wash, I will leave you." Clara felt a sharp pang of regret. "You could come to Prescott, Doc Harrow. He could help you." "Prescott is a cage," Taza said. "I will find my own way." But as the wagon crested a low rise, Taza suddenly stiffened. He grabbed Clara's arm, pulling the reins from her hands. "Halt!" he hissed. Clara froze. "What is it?" Taza stood up on the wagon seat, scanning the horizon. His body was taut as a bowstring. "The birds," he said softly. "They are not circling, they are scattering." He pointed to a distant cluster of mesquite trees near the wash. "Something frightened them," he said. "Something big, and not a coyote." Clara reached for her rifle. "Crow." "Maybe," Taza said. He looked at her, and for the first time, Clara saw fear in his eyes. Not for himself, for her. "Or maybe," he said. "The hunter has found the trail." A gunshot cracked through the silence of the afternoon, echoing off the distant mountains. Dust kicked up near the front hoof of the lead horse. "Drive!" Taza roared, shoving Clara down. "To the wash go!" Clara screamed at the horses, snapping the reins. The wagon surged forward, plunging into the labyrinth of cactus and stone, racing toward the unknown. The peace of the morning was shattered. The hunt was back on. The wagon rattled into the outskirts of Broken Creek just as the sun began to hammer the shadows into submission. It was a dying town, a cluster of sun-bleached timber skeletons clinging to the edge of the Dragoon Mountains, kept alive only by a trickle of water and the stubbornness of its inhabitants. "Keep your head down," Clara murmured. Though Taza was already sliding from the seat, he moved like smoke, disappearing into the dense mesquite brush that lined the road before the wagon wheels had even stopped turning. 1 hour. His voice drifted back to her, barely audible over the crunch of gravel. "Do not let them see the fear in your eyes. Clara, it smells like blood to them." Clara straightened her spine, wiping the dust from her face with her sleeve. She snapped the reins, guiding the tired horses toward the livery stable. She felt the absence of his weight on the bench beside her as a physical coldness, despite the heat. The town was quiet, but it was the quiet of a held breath. Eyes watched from behind dusty window panes. A dog barked once, then fell silent. Clara walked the main street, the heavy ledger box wrapped in a burlap sack and pressed tight against her hip. She needed water. She needed quinine for Taza's shoulder, which was burning hot to the touch. And she needed answers. She pushed open the door to Mallory's boarding house. The air inside was stale, smelling of old beer and lye soap. Ruth Mallory, a woman built like a fortress with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, looked up from the counter. Her eyes widened, then darted instantly to the open door behind Clara. "Close it," Aunt Mallory hissed. Clara pushed the door shut and engaged the deadbolt. "Ruth, You need to get out of here," Mallory interrupted, rounding the counter. She did not hug Clara. She grabbed her shoulders and shook her hard. "Are you mad? Girl Silas Crow has posters up as far as Tucson. He is saying you stole payroll. He is saying you are running with a renegade who butchered a family in the valley." "It is a lie," Clara said, her voice shaking with exhaustion. "All of it. Samuel. Crow had him killed. Ruth, I have the proof." Mallory's face softened, the lines around her mouth deepening. "We knew," she whispered. "We all knew it was not an accident, but knowing and saying are two different things in this territory." She moved to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. "Crow has men here. They sit in the saloon. They watch the road. If they see you—" "I need supplies," Clara said. "And I need to see Dr. Harrow." "Harrow is a drunk," Mallory spat. "Harrow signed the death certificate," Clara countered. "He knows what really happened to Samuel?" Mallory sighed, a sound like a tire losing air. She went behind the counter and pulled out a sack of dried beef and a canteen. "Take the back alley to the surgery. But Clara, if you bring that storm down on us, I will not open this door for you again." "I know," Clara said. "Thank you, Auntie." Clara slipped out the back, moving through the shadows of the alleyways. The doctor's surgery was a small shack at the edge of town. She found Dr. Harrow slumped in a chair on his porch, staring at a bottle of whiskey as if it held the secrets of the universe. He looked up as she approached, his eyes bleary and red-rimmed. "Clara Whitmore," he slurred. "I thought you were a ghost." "Not yet," Clara said, stepping onto the porch. She didn't waste time. "Why did you lie, Dr.?" Harrow flinched. I don't know what you mean." "You wrote accidental fall on Samuel's papers," Clara said, her voice hard. "But you and I both know Samuel could ride a horse backwards in a gale. He didn't fall." Harrow laughed, a bitter, wet sound. "Of course he didn't fall. He was shot, back of the head, execution style." Clara felt the ground sway beneath her. Hearing it confirmed was like taking the bullet herself. "And you covered it up." "Crow was here," Harrow whispered, leaning forward. "He stood right where you are standing. He had his gun on the table. He said if I wrote murder, there would be 2 funerals that week instead of 1. The doctor's hands shook violently as he reached for the bottle. "He took things, Clara, from Samuel's pockets." Clara froze. "What things?" "Coins, a pocket knife," Harrow muttered. "And a paper. A folded piece of paper." Samuel had it buttoned into his vest pocket. Crow read it, and he smiled. That terrible, cold smile. He said, "This is insurance." And he put it in his own coat. Clara's mind raced back to the ledger. Taza had shown her the entry, the bribe. But a bribe in a book was just numbers. It could be dismissed as Samuel's ramblings. But a signed receipt, an order, or perhaps the countersignature from the mining company authorizing the removal of the obstacle. That would be the missing link. That was the page torn from the ledger. "He kept it," Clara whispered. "He didn't destroy it." "He is an arrogant man," Harrow said, closing his eyes. "He thinks he is untouchable. Maybe he is." Clara left him there with his demons. She had what she needed. The ledger was the gun, but the paper in Crow's pocket was the bullet. She had to get him to court, not just to present the book, but to force him to produce that paper. While Clara navigated the treacherous currents of the town, Taza moved through the brush like a phantom. He was not heading for water. He was following a sign, a twisted branch of sagebrush left at a fork in the game trail. He found her by the dry creek bed, sitting on a flat rock, sharpening a skinning knife. Nita. She wore the clothes of the White Eyes, a calico dress, but her hair was loose, and her eyes held the fierce, unyielding light of the old days. "You look like a dead man walking, Taza," she said in their tongue, not looking up. "I have been dead for a long time, Nita," Taza replied, stepping into the open. "I'm just waiting for the earth to realize it." Nita looked at him then. Her gaze went to the bandage on his shoulder, then to his face. There was no warmth in her expression, only a hard, sad recognition. "Why are you here? The bounty hunters are swarming like flies on a carcass." "I am helping the woman," Taza said. "The white woman," Nita corrected. She stood up, sliding the knife into her belt. "They say you act as her dog, guarding her wagon. Is this what you have become? First a scout for the Bluecoats, helping them hunt our brothers, and now a pet for a settler." The words were meant to cut, and they did. Taza felt the old shame burn in his gut. "She is fighting Crow, the same man who drives our people from the valley. She fights for her land," Nita spat. "For her fences. Once she wins, she will put up signs that say, 'No Indians.' Do not fool yourself. You are a tool to her, a map. Once she is safe, she will throw you away." "She is different," Taza said, though even as he said it, he wondered if Nita was right. "There is no difference," Nita said. "There is only us and them, and you. You are neither. The elders have spoken. Taza, if you come back to the fire, they will kill you. They say you sold your soul to the fort." Taza looked out at the vast, empty desert. He had no home. The whites wanted to hang him. His own people wanted to execute him. He was a ghost drifting between two worlds that both wanted him gone. "I did what I did to save my family," Taza said quietly. "And where are they now?" Nita asked softly. "San Carlos, dying of fever in the dust. Your sacrifice bought them nothing but a slower death." She turned to leave. "Go, Taza. Run until your legs break. But do not come back here. You have no kin in this valley." She vanished into the scrub, leaving Taza standing alone in the silence. The weight of his isolation pressed down on him. Heavier than the sky, he was truly alone, except for the woman with the gray eyes who had stitched his flesh and handed him coffee in the rain. They met back at the wagon, hidden in a box canyon 2 miles out of town. The reunion was tense. Clara was pale, her jaw set. Taza was silent, a dark storm brewing behind his eyes. "We have to move," Clara said, tossing the supplies into the back. "Crow has the missing page. He kept it." Taza nodded, not asking how she knew. He trusted her instincts. "Then we go to the Red Rocks. We cut through the Devil's Anvil. It is the only way to lose the trackers." They pushed hard, driving the horses until their flanks were foamed with sweat. The terrain changed from scrubland to a nightmare of twisted red sandstone. Towering spires of rock rose like cathedral pipes, creating a maze of shadows and dead ends. It was here that Mason Rudd found them. The shot did not hit the wagon. It hit the dirt 10 feet in front of the lead horse, sending up a geyser of red dust. The team reared, screaming. Clara fought the reins, slamming on the brake. "Hold!" a voice boomed from the rocks above. Mason Rudd stood on a limestone ledge, his rifle resting casually on his shoulder. He looked like a part of the landscape, dusty and immovable. "That is far enough. Mrs. Whitmore," Rudd called down. "You are driving those horses into the ground." Clara grabbed her Winchester, leveling it at him. Taza was already moving, sliding off the seat to use the wagon body as cover, his pistol drawn. "Do not shoot, Apache," Rudd shouted. "I am not here to kill you, unless you make me." "What do you want, Rudd?" Clara yelled. "I have a proposition," Rudd said, tipping his hat back. "Crow wants you both, but I am a businessman. I look at the risk and the reward. The Indian, he is worth $500 dead or alive. You, Mrs. Whitmore, you are worth $1,000, but only if I bring you in with that box." He paused, letting the numbers hang in the hot air. "Here is the deal," Rudd continued. "You give me the Apache. I tie him up, take him in. I let you go. You take your wagon, your book, and you ride to Prescott. I tell Crow I missed you. You get your life. I get my payday." Clara froze. It was a way out. A clean, simple way out. She could save the land. She could save herself. All she had to do was give up the man who was currently aiming a pistol at the bounty hunter to protect her. She looked at Taza. He was crouching by the wheel, looking up at her. His face was devoid of expectation. He was waiting for the betrayal. He expected it. Nita's words echoed in his mind. "She will throw you away." Clara looked back at Rudd. "You want me to trade a man's life for a head start? He is a fugitive, ma'am," Rudd said reasonably. "He is a killer. You are a respectable woman. Do not mix your blood with his." Clara tightened her grip on the rifle. She thought of the scars on Taza's wrists. She thought of the way he had held his hand on her back during the storm. She thought of Samuel, and how he had died because men like Crow and Rudd treated people like numbers in a ledger. "No," Clara said. Taza's head snapped up. Rudd frowned. "Excuse me, I said no," Clara shouted, her voice ringing off the canyon walls. "I am not selling him. Not to you, not to anyone." "If you want him, you have to come through me," Rudd sighed, shaking his head. "I was afraid you would say that. Shame. I really did not want to shoot a lady." He raised his rifle. "Go!" Clara screamed. Slapping the reins, the wagon lurched forward just as Rudd fired. The bullet splintered the wood of the seat, inches from Clara's hip. Taza returned fire, his shots forcing Rudd to duck back behind the rocks. They careened into the narrow pass, the wagon bouncing violently. "He will follow," Taza shouted, climbing back onto the seat. "We have to lose him in the anvil." They drove into the heart of the red rocks, and then the desert decided to join the fight. The sky turned a sickly yellow-green. The wind died instantly. A pressure built in the air, popping their ears. "Sandstorm!" Taza yelled. "Cover the horses' heads!" It hit them like a wall of solid earth. The world disappeared in a screaming brown haze. The wind howled with the voice of 1,000 demons, scouring the paint from the wagon and the skin from their faces. They had to stop. To move was to drive off a cliff. They huddled under the wagon canvas, the fabric whipping violently. Hour after hour, the storm raged. Inside the wagon, the heat was suffocating, and Taza was burning up. The exertion of the fight and the infection in his shoulder had finally caught up with him. He slumped against the crates, his eyes glassy, his breathing ragged. "Taza!" Clara shouted over the wind, touching his forehead. It was on fire. "Leave me," he rasped, his voice delirious. "The blue coats, they are coming. No one is coming," Clara said, her voice fierce. "And I am not leaving you." The storm raged through the night. By morning, the wind had died, leaving the canyon buried in deep drifts of red sand. The silence was absolute. Clara crawled out. They were alive, but Taza was unconscious. She could not lift him into the wagon. and the wagon was stuck, the wheels buried to the axles in drift sand. "Wake up," she pleaded, shaking him. "Taza, you have to walk." He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He was not there. He was somewhere in the past. Clara did the only thing she could. She grabbed him under the arms and dragged him, inch by inch, foot by foot. She dragged him toward a deep overhang in the cliff face, a place of shade. She was not a large woman, but she possessed the hysterical strength of the desperate. She pulled him into the shadows. She laid him on the cool sand. He was shivering now, violent tremors that shook his whole frame. "Cold," he whispered. "So cold." They had no blankets. They were still in the wagon. Clara looked at him, then at the vast, indifferent desert. She made a choice. She lay down beside him on the sand. She pulled him close, pressing her body against his back, wrapping her arms around his chest to share her warmth. "I have you," she whispered into his hair. "I have you." It was not sexual. It was primal. It was one life clinging to another in the face of the void. She held him through the shakes, murmuring soft nonsense words, the kind one uses to soothe a frightened child or a dying animal. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. Eventually, the tremors stopped. Taza's breathing deepened, slowed. When he woke, the shadows were long. He lay still for a moment, confused. Then he realized where he was. He realized who was holding him. He turned slowly. Clara was awake, her eyes gray and exhausted, watching him. He did not pull away. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was weak, but steady. He squeezed her fingers, not to possess, but to anchor himself to the earth, to verify that she was real. "Why?" he croaked. "You could have taken Rudd's deal." "I do not make deals with devils," Clara said softly. Taza looked at their joined hands. The contrast of his dark skin against her pale fingers was stark, yet they fit together. "My name," he said, his voice raspy. "It is not just Taza." Clara waited. "It is Taza Nantan," he whispered. "It means he who leads in the morning. My father gave it to me. He thought I would lead our people into a new day." He laughed weakly. "But I have only led them into cages." "You are leading me," Clara said fiercely. "You led me through the canyon. You saved my life, and you saved mine," Taza said. He looked into her eyes, stripping away all defenses. "Why, Clara, why fight this hard for a piece of dirt?" "It is not about the dirt anymore," Clara admitted. Her voice broke. "Crow thinks he can erase people. He thinks he can kill Samuel and erase him. He thinks he can put you in a cage and erase you. If I let him take the land, if I let him take the book, then he is right. We are just dust to be swept away." She squeezed his hand back. "I am not fighting for the farm, Taza. I am fighting to prove that we were here, that we mattered." Taza looked at her with a wonder that bordered on reverence. "Then we will make him see," he promised. "We will make him see us." They rested for another hour, drinking the last of the water. Then, with Taza leaning heavily on Clara, they limped out of the red rocks. They reached the edge of the canyon as the sun began to set. Below them lay the narrow gorge of Silver Creek. The bridge, a sturdy wooden structure that spanned the deep chasm, was their only way across to the road that led to Prescott. They stopped dead. The bridge was gone. Charred timbers hung from the far side. Smoke still curled from the wreckage. It had been burned. Recently. "Crow," Taza said, his voice like grinding stones. "He destroyed the bridge," Clara whispered, horror dawning. "Why?" "Because he does not want to catch us on the road," Taza said, looking around the box canyon they were now trapped in. "He wants us right here. He has cut off the exit. He is not hunting anymore." "Clara!" Taza drew his knife, the blade flashing in the dying light. "He is cornering," from the ridges above them. The sound of rifles cocking echoed like thunder in the silence. They were trapped, and the sun was going down. The charred skeleton of the bridge across Silver Creek was not just an obstacle. It was a message. Clara and Taza stood on the rim of the gorge, looking down at the smoldering timbers that had fallen into the dry riverbed below. The smoke rose in thin, gray ribbons, twisting in the evening air like spirits trying to escape the earth. "He is not behind us," Taza said, sheathing his knife with a sharp click. "He is ahead. He knew we would come this way." Clara gripped the stock of her rifle until her knuckles turned white. "The old way station," she said, her voice hollow. "It is the only structure between here and the main road. If we cannot cross here, we have to go through the box canyon." "The station sits right at the choke point." "A kill box," Taza corrected. He looked at her, his face gray with exhaustion, the fever from his shoulder returning to glaze his eyes. "You should stay here. Hide in the rocks. I will draw them out." "No," Clara said. She turned to the wagon, grabbing the metal box containing the ledger. She wrapped it in her shawl and tied it across her chest. "We started this together. We finished it together. Besides, if I stay here, I will die of thirst. If I go forward, I might die of lead. I prefer a quick death." They abandoned the wagon. It was a tomb on wheels now. They took the horses, cutting them loose from the traces. They would ride bareback, low and fast, using the last of the daylight to reach the station before nightfall completely blinded them. The ride was a blur of adrenaline and pain. Taza swayed on his mount, his strength failing, but his hands were steady on the mane of the horse. They rode into the shadow of the station just as the first stars began to pierce the twilight. The way station was a ruin of adobe and rotting timber, a relic of the days before the railroad. It stood in the center of a narrow pass, flanked by high walls of red rock. There was no way around it. They dismounted 50 yards out, creeping forward on foot. The wind whistled through the gaps in the adobe walls, a lonely, mournful sound. "It is too quiet," Taza whispered. "I know," Clara replied. They stepped into the open courtyard of the station. Suddenly, the night exploded with light. Torches flared to life on the roof of the station and from behind the crumbling walls. The sudden brightness was blinding. Clara threw her arm up to shield her eyes, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Drop the guns!" a voice roared. Clara blinked, her eyes adjusting. Standing on the porch of the station, illuminated by the flickering torchlight, was Deputy Silas Crow. He looked immaculate, his uniform pressed, his badge gleaming like a silver coin. He was flanked by 3 men hired guns with dirty dusters and hands hovering over low-slung holsters. "I said drop them," Crow commanded, his voice smooth and terrible. "Unless you want to be buried right here." Clara looked at Taza. He gave a microscopic nod. Slowly, they placed their rifles on the dirt. "Kick them away," Crow ordered. They complied. Crow smiled. Stepping down from the porch, he held a piece of paper in his hand. "Well, Clara, you have led me on quite a chase, a widow and her pet savage. It is almost romantic, in a tragic sort of way. It is over. Silas," Clara said, her voice ringing clear in the canyon. "I have the ledger. I know about the bribes. I know about the murders." Crow laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. "The ledger. You mean the book of fairy tales you forged?" He held up the paper in his hand. It was a single sheet, torn from a binding. "You see, Clara, I have the original record, the one your husband, God rest his soul, tried to steal. This page here, it proves that the mining company purchased your land legally 3 years ago. Samuel was squatting, and you are just a trespassing thief." Clara stared at the page. It was the missing sheet, the one Samuel had died for. Crow was going to use the truth to paint a lie. "That is a forgery," Clara shouted. "And you know it. Who is the judge going to believe?" Crow asked softly, walking closer. "A decorated deputy of the territory, or a desperate woman running with an Apache killer? I reckon the judge might want to hear from a third party." The new voice came from the shadows to their left. Mason Rudd stepped out from behind a pile of fallen rocks. He held his rifle loosely, but the barrel was pointed generally at the group. Crow's smile faltered. "Rudd, you are late. I ran into a sandstorm," Rudd drawled. He looked at Clara, then at Taza. "I see you caught them. Where is my money? Silas, you will get your money when I see bodies." Crow snapped. "Put a bullet in the Indian. Mason, Earn your keep. Rudd chewed on the end of an unlit cigar. He did not raise his rifle. That was not the deal. The deal was captured. I do not do executions, not for free. I am the law here, Crow shouted, losing his composure. I say he dies resisting arrest. He does not look like he is resisting, Rudd observed. Taza stood perfectly still, his eyes scanning the ridges above the station. He sensed them before he saw them. Shadows moving within shadows. The silence of the desert had changed texture. We are not alone, Taza said, his voice cutting through the argument. Crow spun around. What? On the high ridge overlooking the station, a silhouette appeared against the moon, then another, and another. It was Nita, and with her were 6 Apache warriors, mounted on ponies, their rifles resting across their saddles. They did not move. They did not yell war cries. They simply watched. Geronimo's ghosts, one of Crow's men whispered, backing away. Shoot them, Crow screamed at his men. Shoot them all. If you fire, Taza said calmly, you will all die. They are not here for me. They are here to see if the White Eyes have any honor left. Crow looked up at the silent warriors, then back at Taza. His face twisted with hatred. He realized his control was slipping. The trap was closing on the trapper. Kill him, Crow hissed to his nearest man. The gunman reached for his pistol. No, Clara screamed. She did not dive for a weapon. She did not run. She stepped forward, placing herself between Taza and the guns. She ripped the shawl away, exposing the metal box. You want to talk about honor? Silas? Clara shouted. Her voice was not the voice of a scared widow. It was the voice of a prosecutor. Let us talk about September 12th, 1885. Crow froze. Shut your mouth. Clara did not shut her mouth. She opened her memory. Taza had taught her to read the land. Now she used the words she had memorized by the firelight to burn Crow's world down. Payment to Silas Crow, she recited, her voice booming off the canyon walls. $500, direct deposit from the Copper Queen mine, purpose security services regarding the Whitmore claim. Lies, Crow yelled, raising his own pistol. October 1st, Clara continued, stepping closer to him, her eyes blazing. Payment to Mason Rudd, $200. Purpose harassment of local settlers. Denied, ask him, he is standing right there. Rudd stiffened. He looked at Crow. You put my name in a book. Silas, you said this was off the books. She is making it up, Crow screeched. November 5th, Clara yelled. Tears of rage streaming down her dust-caked face. Payment for obstacle removal. Target Samuel Whitmore. Price $500. Note, accidental death arranged. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop to listen. Crow's hand was shaking. The gun in his hand wavered. He was not an obstacle, Clara whispered, her voice breaking. He was a man. He was my husband, and you sold him for $500. Crow's face contorted. The mask of the charming deputy shattered, revealing the rot underneath. He was a fool, Crow roared. I gave him a chance to sell. I told him to walk away, but he had to be a hero. He had to keep that damn book. He squealed like a stuck pig when I put the gun to his head. Clara, begged for you, begged me not to hurt you. Crow's eyes were wild. I did him a favor. I made it quick. He had said it. He had confessed. Mason Rudd let out a low whistle. Well, the bounty hunter said, that sounds like a confession to me. Crow realized what he had done. He saw the look in his men's eyes, disgust, fear. He saw the Apaches on the ridge, silent judges. He saw Rudd's hand tightening on his rifle. Panic took the wheel. Kill them! Crow shrieked. Raising his gun at Clara, he fired. But Taza was faster, despite the fever, despite the wound. Taza moved with the explosive speed of a striking viper. He shoved Clara to the ground, the bullet tearing through the air where she had been standing. Then he was on Crow. He did not use a knife. He did not use a gun. He used his body. He slammed into the deputy, driving him into the dirt. Crow's hired guns opened fire. Cover, Rudd shouted, diving behind a water trough and opening up with his Winchester. He was shooting at Crow's men. He had switched sides. The courtyard erupted into chaos. Gunfire flashed in the dark. Taza rolled, dodging a shot from a deputy. He swept the man's legs out from under him, a bone-breaking kick that sent the gunman screaming to the ground. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the pistol dropped, then delivered a single, precise chop to the temple. The man went limp. Taza was a whirlwind of controlled violence. He was not killing, he was dismantling it. He broke an arm here, shattered a knee there. He was showing Nita on the ridge, showing Clara, showing history that he was not the savage they claimed. He was a warrior who mastered his rage. But Crow had scrambled to his feet. He grabbed a shotgun dropped by one of his fallen men. He swung it toward Taza, whose back was turned. "Taza!" Clara screamed. She was on the ground, her hand closing around the revolver Crow's deputy had dropped. She raised the gun. The weight of it was familiar. She aimed at Crow's chest. Crow racked the slide of the shotgun. Clara fired. The bullet did not hit Crow's heart. It struck the shotgun, shattering the wooden stock and sending shrapnel into Crow's hands. Crow screamed. Dropping the weapon and clutching his bleeding fingers, he fell to his knees, sobbing. Silence returned to the station. The hired men were groaning on the ground. Crow was defeated. Taza stood over him, his chest heaving. Blood was soaking through the bandage on his shoulder, and a new dark stain was spreading on his side. He had been hit. He looked down at Crow. He picked up the knife from the dirt. Crow looked up, eyes wide with terror. "Do it," he whimpered. "Do it, you savage! Finish it!" Taza looked at the knife. Then he looked up at the ridge. Nita was watching. He looked at Clara. She was getting to her feet, the smoking pistol still in her hand. Taza flipped the knife in his hand. With a sudden, violent motion, he drove it down. Crow flinched, closing his eyes. The knife buried itself in the earth, an inch from Crow's ear. Quivering, "I am not your executioner," Taza said, his voice raspy but strong. "You do not get the easy way out. You get the cage, you get the chains, you get to live with what you are." He stepped back. Clara walked forward. She stood over Crow. She could shoot him. No jury in the territory would convict her. He had confessed to murdering her husband. The rage in her blood demanded it. She cocked the hammer of the revolver. She pressed the barrel against Crow's forehead. Crow squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking out. "Samuel begged for my life," Clara whispered. "So I will save yours, not for you, but for him, because he was a good man, and I will not let you turn me into a murderer." She slowly uncorked the hammer and lowered the gun. "Tie him up," she said to Rudd. Rudd stepped forward, shaking his head with a grin. "You folks are making it very hard for a man to make a dishonest living." He pulled a length of rope from his belt. "Get up, Silas. You are going to look real pretty in stripes." Clara turned to Taza. She wanted to run to him, to thank him, but Taza swayed. His legs buckled. "Taza!" She caught him as he fell, the impact driving the air from her lungs. She lowered him to the dust. "I am fine," he whispered, but his lips were pale. "Just tired." Clara pressed her hands against his side. The blood was warm and slick. It was flowing too fast. "You are shot," she said, panic rising in her throat. "Rudd, I need help." Rudd finished tying Crow and ran over. He looked at the wound. "Gut shot," he said grimly. "Passed through the side. It missed the vitals, I think, but he is losing a lot of blood." Clara ripped the hem of her petticoat, pressing the cloth into the wound. "Stay with me," she ordered Taza. "Do not you dare leave me now. We won. We beat him." Taza looked up at the ridge. The Apaches were gone. They had seen what they needed to see. The savage had shown mercy. The traitor had fought with honor. "Right place," Taza whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. "Darling." His eyes rolled back, and his head lolled against Clara's shoulder. "No," Clara sobbed, pressing harder on the wound. "No, no, no!" The victory tasted of ash. The ledger was safe. Crow was bound. but the cost of freedom lay bleeding in her arms. The nearest doctor was 3 days away. "We have to cauterize it," Rudd said, pulling his knife. "And we have to do it now." Clara looked at Taza's unconscious face. She wiped a tear from her cheek, leaving a streak of his blood on her skin. "Do it," she said, as Rudd moved to the fire to heat the blade. Clara held Taza's hand. She squeezed it, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. "Do not take him. Take the land. Take the book. But do not take him." The night settled over the canyon, heavy and cold. The battle was over, but the war for Taza's life had just begun. The journey to Prescott was a blur of dust, pain, and the rhythmic jouncing of the wagon that Mason Rudd had commandeered. When they finally rolled onto the cobblestones of the territorial capital, Clara Whitmore felt less like a victor and more like a survivor of a shipwreck who had washed up on a jagged shore. Prescott was a world away from the desolate canyons. It smelled of coal smoke, expensive tobacco, and the unwashed mass of humanity clamoring for civilization. Gas lamps flickered on the corners, and men in suits walked with the hurried importance of those who believed they owned the future. But as the wagon moved through the thoroughfare, the civilization peeled back to reveal its teeth. Taza lay in the back, covered by a rough wool blanket, his face gray and beaded with sweat despite the cool mountain air. The cauterized wound in his side was a burning coal, but he remained silent. Clara sat beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, a defiant shield against the eyes that watched them pass. And the eyes were everywhere. They did not see a hero who had stopped a corrupt deputy. They did not see a man who had saved a white woman from a burning waste station. They saw an Apache. They saw the enemy. Women pulled their children closer to their skirts. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to spit into the dust, their hands drifting toward the pistols at their hips. "Keep moving," Mason Rudd growled from the driver's seat, flicking the reins. "Do not look at them. Mrs. Whitmore, you cannot shame a dog for barking." They brought Taza to a small room at the back of a livery stable. Not the hospital, the town doctor, a man named Dr. Aris, who smelled of antiseptic and prejudice, had refused to treat the Indian in the main ward. Clara had nearly drawn her gun on him, but Taza had gripped her wrist, his skin burning hot. "Do not fight the river," he had whispered. "Let it flow." The days that followed were a trial in every sense of the word. Clara stood before the territorial judge, a man with a beard like a snowdrift and eyes like flint. She presented the metal box. She presented the ledger. She presented the testimony of Dr. Harrow, which she had written down and forced the trembling physician to sign back in Broken Creek. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with heat and murmurs. When Clara read the entry about the $500 paid for the obstacle removal of Samuel Whitmore, a silence descended that was heavier than the grave. Silas Crow, standing in the dock with his hands bandaged and shackled, looked small, without his badge, without his gun. He was just a man who had sold his soul for copper and coin. The gavel came down like a gunshot. Crow was stripped of his rank and remanded to the federal marshals to await trial for murder and conspiracy. The mining company's operations were suspended pending a federal investigation. It was a victory. It was the justice Clara had prayed for on her knees for months. But when she walked out of the courthouse, clutching the paper that affirmed her title to the land, she felt no jubilation. She looked at the crowd gathering on the steps. They parted for her, offering congratulatory nods, but their eyes slid over her shoulder, looking for the Apache. Their whispers were not about justice. They were about the scandal. A widow, alone in the canyon with a savage. What really happened out there, Clara walked straight to the livery stable. Taza was sitting up on the cot, cleaning his fingernails with a small knife. He looked better. The fever had broken the night before, leaving him weak but clear-eyed. He wore a fresh shirt Rudd had bought him, but he looked like a wolf wearing a saddle. "They threw Crow in a cell," Clara said, leaning against the doorframe. "It is done. Taza, the land is safe." Taza did not smile. He looked out the small window where the brick wall of the next building blocked the view of the mountains. "The paper is safe," he corrected. But the wind has not changed. You could stay, Clara said, though she knew the answer before she spoke. Mason said there might be work for a scout with the marshals, now that the truth is out. Taza laughed softly, a sound devoid of humor. Clara, walk with me down the street. Let us buy an apple. Let us see how many steps we take before someone calls me a murderer. Let us see how long before a drunk with a grievance decides to finish what Crow started. He stood up, wincing as the fresh stitches pulled tight. The law of the white eyes is written on paper. It changes when the ink is wet. Today I am a witness. Tomorrow, when the mine owners send new men with new money, I will be a nuisance. And the day after that, I will be a target. Clara looked at him, her heart aching. He was right. The courtroom had given her justice, but it had not given him a place in this world. Where will you go? She asked. There are places in the deep mountains, Taza said. Places where the horses of the marshals cannot climb. I need to breathe air that does not taste like coal. I am going back to the cabin, Clara said quietly. I am going to plant the spring corn. Taza looked at her, his dark eyes softening. It is a hard land for a woman alone. I am not the same woman who left it, Clara replied. The next morning, Clara went to the general store to buy supplies for the return trip nails, hinges, flour, coffee, as she was loading the sacks onto a mule she had purchased to replace her team. A shadow fell across her. She turned to see Nita standing by the water trough. The Apache woman wore a faded calico skirt and a man's vest, her hair braided with strips of red cloth. She stood perfectly still, like a deer that had decided not to run. Clara stiffened. She remembered the ridge. She remembered the rifles. He is leaving, Nita said. It was not a question. He is, Clara answered. The town is not safe for him. Nita stepped closer. Her face was a map of the sun and wind, hard and unyielding. And you go back to your wooden box on the creek. It is my home, Clara said. Is it? Nita tilted her head. Or is it just the place where you keep your things? She looked at Clara with a scrutiny that made Clara feel as though her skin were made of glass. You saved his life, white woman. For that, the people will not hunt you. But do not think you own him. I do not own anyone, Clara said sharply. He is a free man. Is he? Nita challenged. You look at him and you see a hero. You see the man who bleeds for you. But do you see the man who wakes up screaming because he remembers the chains at San Carlos? Do you see the man who cannot hear the wind because the noise of your world is too loud? Clara fell silent. She thought of the nights in the canyon, the scars on Taza's wrists, the silence that sometimes overtook him, a silence so deep it felt like drowning. He is not a story for you to tell your children, Nita said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He is not a pet wolf to guard your door. If you love the idea of him, let him go. He will die if he tries to be what you want. I do not want him to be anything but Taza, Clara said, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. I do not want a guard dog. Nita, I want him to know he has a place to rest where he does not have to be a warrior. Nita studied her for a long moment. The hostility in her eyes did not vanish, but it receded, replaced by a grudging respect. He has not rested in 10 years, Nita said. If you can give him that, then perhaps you are not just another taker. She reached into her vest and pulled out a small pouch made of soft buckskin. She pressed it into Clara's hand. Sage, Nita said. Nita. Burn it when the ghosts get too loud. For the house, and for him. Before Clara could say thank you, Nita turned and walked away, disappearing into the bustling crowd of the morning market as if she had never been there. The journey back to the cabin took 3 days. They moved slowly, respecting Taza's injury. They did not take the wagon. The mule carried their supplies, and they walked or rode double on the single horse Clara had managed to reclaim from the livery. The silence between them was different now. It was not the tense silence of the hunted, nor the awkward silence of strangers. It was a companionable silence, the kind that exists between two people who have seen the worst of the world and survived it together. When they finally crested the ridge and looked down at the cabin, Clara felt a lump form in her throat. It was battered. The storm had torn shingles from the roof. The door hung crookedly on one hinge, banging softly in the breeze. The garden was overgrown with weeds, but it was still standing. "It needs work," Taza said, standing beside her. "Everything does," Clara replied. They went down. They did not rush. They watered the animals in the creek, which was running clear and cold again. They built a fire in the stone circle outside, judging the cabin too stuffy after weeks of abandonment. For the next 2 days, the rhythm of their lives slowed down. It was a time of mending. Clara spent the mornings clearing the weeds from the garden patch, her hands working the soil that Samuel had loved. Taza could not lift heavy beams or chop wood yet, but he did not sit idle. He sat on the porch, whittling new pegs for the shutters, repairing the leather harnesses, cleaning the rust from the tools. On the third afternoon, Clara decided to fix the front door. It was a heavy slab of oak, warped by the sun and rain. The hinges were bent. The wood splintered where Crow's men had likely kicked it open months ago, looking for things to steal. Clara gathered her tools, a hammer, a bag of fresh nails, and a plane. She set to work removing the old hinges. The metal screeched in protest, rusted tight. Taza watched her from the steps. He was chewing on a piece of dried grass, his eyes following the movement of her hands. "You hold the hammer like a blacksmith," he observed. "My father wanted a son," Clara grunted, putting her weight into the pry bar. With a loud crack, the hinge gave way. "He got me. He decided not to waste the education." She lifted the heavy door, straining under the weight. Taza moved to help, but she shook her head. "I have got it. You watch your stitches." She laid the door on 2 sawhorses. She planed the warped edge, the shavings curling up like ribbons of gold in the sunlight. She smelled the fresh pine and the ancient dust. It had a good smell. It was the beginning of the smell. "Why fix the lock?" Taza asked quietly. "Crow is gone. The Apaches know you are a friend. Who are you locking out?" Clara stopped planning. She ran her hand over the smooth wood. "I am not locking anyone out," she said. "I am making sure it closes properly. A door that does not close. It lets the cold in. It lets the coyotes in." She looked at him. "But a door that works. You can choose when to open it." She positioned the door back in the frame. This time, she allowed Taza to hold it steady while she hammered the new pins into the hinges. The sound of the hammer striking iron rang out across the valley clang. Clang, clang a bell, announcing that life had returned. She tested it. The door swung shut with a solid, satisfying thud. She lifted the latch. It clicked into place. "There," she said, wiping sweat from her brow. "Safe." Taza reached out and touched the latch. "It is a good door," he said. "Strong. It will hold," Clara said. "Against the wind and the world." That evening, they sat by the fire inside the cabin. Clara had burned the sage Nita gave her. The sweet, pungent smoke hung in the rafters, chasing away the smell of neglect. They ate a simple meal beans flavored with salt pork and biscuits made from the flour she had bought in Prescott. It was humble food, but to Clara, it tasted like a feast. The firelight cast long shadows on the walls. Taza was sitting in Samuel's old rocking chair. Though he did not rock, he seemed more at ease than she had ever seen him, his guard lowered in the sanctity of the space she had reclaimed. "You know," Taza said, his voice low, breaking the comfortable silence. "That day, in the cabin?" Clara looked up from her mending. "The day we met." "The day I was bleeding on your floor and you pointed a Winchester at my heart," Taza corrected, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I told you, right place, darling." Clara nodded, a small smile mirroring his. "I remember. You sounded so arrogant. I wanted to shoot you just for the tone." Taza chuckled, a sound that rumbled deep in his chest. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face. "I was terrified," he confessed. Clara stopped stitching. She stared at him. "What?" "I was terrified," Taza repeated softly. "My leg was numb. My shoulder felt like it was on fire. I had lost so much blood, I was seeing two of you. And when you walked in, that look in your eyes, it was not the look of a scared settler. It was the look of a woman who had buried everything she loved and had nothing left to lose. He shook his head, looking down at his hands. I thought, this is it. This is the end. I escaped the army. I escaped the bounty hunters. And I am going to die naked in a stranger's kitchen because a woman with gray eyes is tired of being pushed. Clara felt a bubble of laughter rising in her chest. It started as a giggle, then turned into a full, throaty laugh. She laughed until tears pricked her eyes. It was the first time she had laughed in months, maybe years. It felt like breaking a dam. You, she gasped, wiping her eyes. Terrified, you looked like you owned the place. You look like a king on a throne of dust. It was a bluff, Taza admitted, grinning now. The biggest bluff of my life. I thought if I acted like I belonged there, you might hesitate long enough for me to explain. It worked, Clara said, her laughter subsiding into a warm glow. Barely, Taza agreed. He looked at her across the fire. The amusement faded from his face, replaced by a profound tenderness. I am glad you hesitated. Clara, me too, Clara whispered. The atmosphere in the room shifted. It was no longer about survival, or danger, or the past. It was about the present, the fire, the walls, the two of them. Taza stood up slowly. He walked over to where she sat. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, offering his presence. Nita was right, he said quietly. I have been running for a long time. I do not know how to stop. Clara looked up at him. You do not have to stop, Taza. You just have to pause. Rest. She reached out and took his hand. His skin was warm, rough with calluses, mapped with history. The door is fixed, she said softly. The latch works. If you want to go, you can go, but if you want to stay, it is open. Taza looked at the door, then back at her. He squeezed her hand. The mountains are cold tonight, he said. The fire is warm. Clara replied. Then perhaps, Taza said, sitting down on the rug beside her chair. I will stay for the fire. He did not promise forever. He did not promise tomorrow. He promised tonight. And in a world where life could be ended by a bullet or a fever in the blink of an eye, tonight was enough. Clara went back to her mending, the needle weaving in and out of the fabric, stitching together the torn edges of her life. Taza watched the flames, the ghost of the hunted wolf fading from his eyes, replaced by the calm of a man who had finally found a place to close his eyes without fear. Outside, the wind howled against the sturdy oak door, but inside, the flame burned steady and bright. The weeks that followed the trial in Prescott were not marked by the banging of gavels or the roar of gunfights, but by the quiet, grinding noise of a machine stripping its gears. The federal investigation into the Copper Queen Mining Company moved with the slow, crushing weight of a glacier. Investigators from Washington, men in dusty suits who looked at the Arizona heat with personal offense, descended on Bitter Creek. They seized records. They interviewed witnesses. And most importantly, they avoided deeds. Silas Crow did not hang. The territory was trying to look civilized, and hanging a former deputy without a murder conviction that stuck since Samuel's body was never exhumed was deemed untidy. Instead, he was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor at the Yuma Territorial Prison for corruption, extortion, and fraud, when the prison wagon rolled through town to take him away. Clara did not go to watch. She did not need to see him in chains to know he was gone. She was busy. She was planting corn. The sun was high and bright over the valley, but it felt different now. It was no longer a hostile force trying to bake life out of the soil. It was just the sun. Clara worked the hoe into the earth, turning the soil that had lain fallow since Samuel died. She stopped to wipe her brow, leaning on the handle. She looked at the cabin. The shutters, which had been barred tight for months, were thrown wide open. Muslin curtains drifted in the breeze, white flags of peace. She was not hiding anymore. Down by the creek, A rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack echoed against the canyon walls. Taza was clearing brush. He had not moved into the cabin. It was too enclosed, too full of the ghosts of a life that was not his. Instead, he had built a structure in the grove of cottonwoods near the water, a gawa, a traditional Apache dwelling made of bent willow branches and covered with canvas and brush. It was simple, airy, and invisible, unless one knew exactly where to look. It was close enough to see the smoke from Clara's chimney, but far enough to give them both the dignity of space. Clara walked down to the creek with a bucket of water. Taza stopped working as she approached. His shoulder had healed into a jagged scar, another line on the map of his body, but he moved with his old fluidity. "You are working too hard," Clara said, handing him the ladle. "The brush has been there for 50 years. It will wait another day." Taza drank deep, water spilling down his chin. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. "The brush hides the snakes," he said. "If we are to bring the horses down here to graze, the ground must be clear." "We?" Clara asked, a small smile playing on her lips. Taza looked at her over the rim of the ladle. "Unless you plan to pull the plow yourself." He did not smile back, but his eyes were light. He was no longer the cornered animal she had found in her kitchen. He was still watchful, still carried a knife at his belt. But the desperate tension that had vibrated in his frame was gone. He was like a hawk that had found a thermal still wild, but resting in the air. Later that afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge. Clara instinctively reached for the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Taza, who was repairing a bridle on the steps, did not move. "It is Nita," he said without looking up. The Apache woman rode down the slope on a spotted pony. She did not come to the cabin. She stopped by the creek, near Taza's gawa. Clara watched from the porch, her heart beating a little faster. She knew this was a test. Taza walked out to meet her. They spoke in their own tongue, their voices low and carried away by the wind. Clara could not understand the words, but she understood the body language. Nita did not dismount. She sat tall, her posture rigid. Taza stood with his hands open at his sides. Then, Nita reached into a saddlebag. She pulled out a small bundle wrapped in deerskin and handed it to Taza. It was not a weapon. It was a bag of seed corn, the deep red and blue corn of the high mesas. It was an offering, not of friendship, perhaps, but of acknowledgement. It was permission to plant, permission to stay. Nita turned her pony and looked up at the cabin. She caught Clara's eye. She did not wave. She simply nodded once, a sharp, singular motion, before kicking her horse into a trot and vanishing back into the scrub. Taza walked back to the porch, holding the deerskin bag. "She says the rains will be good this year," Taza said quietly. "She says the earth here is thirsty." "She gave you seeds," Clara said. "She gave us a season," Taza corrected. "They will watch. They will see if I remember who I am. If I grow fat and lazy, they will turn their backs again." "You," Clara laughed softly. "Fat and lazy, I have seen you pace the floor because the wind changed direction." Taza looked down at the seeds. "It is a start. Clara, it is not home, but it is a place to stand." The weeks turned into months. The valley changed. The Miller family, who had been evicted, returned to their plot down the road. Others followed. Bitter Creek began to wake up. But Clara and Taza lived in a world of their own making. It was a quiet world. They did not speak of love. The word felt too small, too frilly for what lay between them. Love was what people in novels felt before they got married and lived happily ever after. What Clara and Taza had was forged in fire and blood. It was a bond of shared survival. It was the knowledge that if one of them fell, the other would be there to catch them. Not out of obligation, but out of reflex. They fell into a rhythm. In the mornings, Taza would check the trap lines or hunt in the high ridges. In the afternoons, he would help Clara with the heavy work on the farm, mending fences, digging irrigation ditches, breaking horses. In the evenings, they sat on the porch. Sometimes they talked. Often, they did not. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in impossible shades of violet and gold. Taza spoke. "The marshals came to the edge of the property today," he said. Clara looked up from her book. "I did not see them." "I saw them," Taza said. "They were looking for a man who robbed the stagecoach near Flagstaff. They saw me. They put their hands on their guns." Clara felt a flash of the old anger. "Did they say anything?" "No," Taza said. "They watched. I was building the stone wall. I put a rock in place. I did not look at them." Eventually, they rode on. He leaned back against the post, looking out at the darkening valley. "They did not see a renegade," Taza said softly. "They saw a man building a wall. It confused them." "Good," Clara said fiercely. "Let them be confused. Let them wonder." "It will always be this way," Taza said, turning to look at her. "I will never be one of them, and I can never go back to being who I was before the fort. I am something else now." "You are Taza," Clara said. "And who is that?" he asked. "A warrior without a war? A scout without an army?" Clara stood up. She walked over to the railing where he leaned. She was close enough to smell the sage and wood smoke on his skin. "You are the man who stopped the fire," she said. "You are the man who saved the truth. You do not need a war to be whole." "Taza," he looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "And you, Clara, you have your land. You have your peace. You do not need a shadow in your garden." "A garden without shade burns in the sun," Clara replied. "I do not want to be alone in this house. Taza, I tried that. It is cold." He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were rough, his grip strong. He did not pull her closer. He just held her. "Then I will stay," he said, "until the shade is no longer needed." "That might be a long time," Clara whispered. "I have time," Taza said. The ending came not with a bang, but with a sunrise. It was a crisp morning in late October. The air was sharp enough to bite, carrying the scent of pine and drying leaves. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, holding 2 tin cups of coffee. The steam rose in curling wisps, disappearing into the clear blue sky. She wore a simple dress of blue wool, and her hair was tied back loosely. She looked tired. Farming was hard work, but her eyes were clear. The shadows that had haunted them since Samuel's death were gone. Taza was by the gate. He was finishing a new fence, setting the final post of split cedar. He wore a canvas shirt and trousers, but he still wore his moccasins, refusing the heavy boots of the settlers. He tamped the dirt down around the post, testing it with his shoulder. It held firm. He looked up and saw her watching him. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked up the path to the porch. Clara handed him a cup. "Black, like your soul." Taza took it, a grin cracking his stoic face. "My soul is sweet. It is your coffee that is bitter." They stood together on the porch, looking out over the valley. The corn was high and brown, ready for harvest. The horses were grazing in the lower pasture. The creek sang its endless song over the stones. It was imperfect. The roof still leaked when the rain blew from the north. The town still whispered. There were still nights when Taza woke up reaching for a knife that wasn't there, and nights when Clara reached for a husband who was gone. But it was real. "I have been thinking," Clara said, looking at the fence line. "That is dangerous." Taza murmured into his cup. "I have been thinking about names." She continued, ignoring him. "You call me Clara. Everyone calls me Clara. Or Widow Whitmore. It is a good name," Taza said. "And everyone calls you Taza," she said. "Or other things. Also good names." Taza shrugged. "Mostly." Clara turned to him. She looked at him with a directness that stripped away all pretense. "Taza Nantan," she said. He went still. He had told her that name only once, in the delirium of fever and the red rocks. He had not heard it spoken aloud in years. "He who leads in the morning." Clara translated softly. "That is who you are. You did not lead an army, Taza, but you led us out of the dark. You led yourself out." Taza looked at her. His eyes shimmered with a sudden, fierce emotion. To be named is to be known, and to be known is the opposite of being alone. He set his cup down on the railing. He turned fully toward her. "Clara," he said. He did not say it like a settler. He did not say it like a question. He said it with a weight and a warmth that filled the space between them. He said it the way a man says the word hearth or sanctuary. "You are the morning," he said simply. Clara smiled. It wasn't a sad smile. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was the smile of a woman who had walked through hell and come out the other side with her pockets full of seeds. "Breakfast is in 10 minutes, she said. "Do not let the coffee get cold." "I will be there," Taza promised. Clara turned and went back into the cabin, leaving the door wide open behind her. Taza stayed on the porch for a moment longer. He looked at the horizon, where the road wound its way toward Prescott and the world beyond. The road was still there. The dangers were still there. But he did not feel the urge to run. He looked at the open door. He picked up his coffee and followed her inside. The wind blew through the valley, rustling the cornstalks. A hawk circled overhead, crying out once before diving toward the mesa. The sun climbed higher, bathing the little cabin in light. It was a good day to be alive. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We have traveled a long, dusty road with Clara and Taza, from the red rocks of the canyon to the quiet peace of the morning porch. If you enjoyed this tale of the frontier, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. Are you on your own porch with a coffee? Or perhaps commuting through a concrete canyon? Let's share our stories. And if you want to hear more tales of grit, gunfire, and the human heart in the Wild West, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like this video to help us ride further. And if you truly enjoyed the journey, hit that hype button so this story can reach more ears. Until the next campfire, ride safe.